Welcome to Labor Solidarity, which is an Empathy Media Lab production, highlighting the work of labor leaders and discussing historic struggles and the importance of organizing to new audiences with the goal of building international labor solidarity. Today, I'm speaking with Barbara Ellen Smith, who is the author and editor of 4 books and numerous articles about labor, women, and social movements in Appalachia and the South, including Digging Our Own Graves, Coal Miners, and the Struggle Over Black Lung Disease. She lives in Charleston, West Virginia, and is a professor emerita at Virginia Tech. Barbara is also a board member of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum and chair of the museum fundraising committee. We'll be discussing the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum today. That is a site of a historic battle which erupted in May of 1920, setting into motion a chain of events that led to the largest armed uprising in the United States since our Civil War, and offers the largest exhibition of mine wars history anywhere in the United States. Barbara, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Evan. It's great to be here.
So could you begin by introducing yourself and how you got into the labor movement?
Sure. So I was about 19 years old when I moved to Charleston, West Virginia to work for the Black Lung Association. And that was really the beginning of my relationship to labor issues in coal. And it really became kind of a lifelong interest and commitment. So, as you mentioned, I became a professor eventually and wrote and taught a lot about coal, Appalachian studies, sociology, that's what I was trained in, women's and gender studies. And then when I retired, I moved back to Charleston and became a board member of the Mine Wars Museum in 2018.
And could you talk about what black lung disease is and how people get it?
Sure. Black lung is a chronic and ultimately fatal respiratory disease that coal miners get from inhaling coal dust in the workplace. Above ground miners can get black lung, but certainly those who work underground tend to get it at higher rates. And we've seen a real increase in the last few decades of the number, the percent of miners who are contracting the disease, and especially those who are getting the most advanced and debilitating form of it. And while the technical explanation of that involves the changing composition of coal mine dust, which increasingly has silica in it, I would argue that it's also a function of the destruction of miners' power in the workplace related to the offensive against the mine workers that started in the 1980s. So black lung has been around for centuries since coal has been mined, but its existence was denied for many, many decades by the medical profession in the United States. And so it really required miners and their families and their allies, their intervention to force the recognition of black lung as a compensable work-related disease.
Well, I think the rebellion of the workers leads us to the next question of what were the mine wars and why did it happen?
So the mine wars were a period of about 2 decades at the beginning of the 20th century when miners fought the coal operators who were determined not to allow the Union into southern West Virginia. They fought in a series of battles, some of them with arms and violence, and eventually culminated in the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, which is probably the most famous episode in the mine wars, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. But let me just note that the context for this was the company town system, where the great majority of coal miners in West Virginia lived in towns where not just the workplace was owned, by the coal operators, but the entire infrastructure of the town. So all the housing is owned by the coal company, the store is owned by the coal company. You get paid in scrip, which is a currency that you can't use anywhere else except at that company store in that town. The law enforcement is controlled by the coal company. Access to the town in some cases via railroads and roads can be controlled by the coal company. So it's really kind of this total system, incredibly repressive and anti-democratic. And as bad as the working conditions were in many mines, in terms of the danger, inadequate ventilation, and so on, it was actually these repressive features of town life, the profound lack of democracy, that really rankled most miners the most, and precipitated this continued effort to gain unionization so that they could have a voice, not only in the workplace, but in the larger town. So the mine war started around 1902. There were fierce battles about 10 years later on Paint Creek and Cabin Creek, which lie to the east of Charleston, state capital, and about the middle of the state. And then, as you mentioned in the introduction, in 1920, there was a battle in Matewan, which is in Mingo County, and is also where the Mine Working Museum is located, when the private mine guard from the Baldwin Phelps Detective Agency arrived in town to evict miners who were on strike. And unusual, very unusual for this area and time, the local police chief, Ted Hatfield, was actually a supporter of the union. And in the confrontation that followed, there was gunfire, and several of the detectives were killed, as were a few miners. Later, Hatfield and his deputy were attacked on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in Jason County, and murdered in cold blood. They were unarmed. During the same period of time, a black miner who was on strike was, his name was Alex Breedlove, was killed by a member of the state police. And so miners, this was enough. This was more than enough. It was like, okay, we had it. So miners who had managed to unionize during the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike, so a little bit to the north of Mingo County, McDowell County, Logan County, in the southernmost part of West Virginia, they decided that they would, after the governor rejected their demands to end the mine guard system, the private system of supposed law enforcement, they decided to march south into Mingo County, where miners were on strike. But to get there, they had to cross through Logan County, which was a stronghold of anti-unionism controlled by the sheriff, John Chapin, whose salary was paid in part by the coal operators. And so miners from 10,000, 15,000, the estimates vary, amassed in Marmet, outside of Charleston, and then marched south into Logan County, where at the summit of Blair Mountain, which is about a 20-mile-long ridge line, they met Chapin and his forces, the so-called Logan Defenders, and battled for 5 days. And were only, the battle was only ended with the arrival of U.S. Army troops. And it was not because the troops began firing on miners, but because many were veterans of World War I, and they were unwilling to fight fellow soldiers. And so they laid down their weapons.
Yeah, this history is completely buried. I have been very much interested in history, world history, US history. I studied political science and public policy, and I only became aware of this battle in the last few years. And I had the privilege last year to travel for the 100-year anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain in Charleston into Matewan, and was able to actually get to Matewan. And it was a, yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful area right on the border of Kentucky and the southwestern part of West Virginia, some of the most beautiful country in this country and in the world. And it felt, for me, it was almost like a mecca for labor acknowledgement of the struggles that have happened to give us the rights that we have currently within labor. And I believe the battle actually set back a lot of the union efforts for 10, 20 years, but the actual United Mine Workers grew much stronger in being able to organize from that as well. And also there was a very large strategic component, as I understand it, where that area could produce enough coal. It was ununionized area, and it could produce enough coal if all the other areas, all the other unions went on strike. If this area kept producing coal, they could outlast a strike as well. So it was very strategic to also unionize this area as well. Um, so could you talk about why you wanted to create the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum and to bring about this history to a larger consciousness, and what are some of the past efforts that have tried to suppress the mine wars history?
Sure. So let me mention something that I think is a very important part of the reason why this history has been suppressed first, and which I failed to mention in talking about the mine wars. And that is that this was an interracial, interethnic, that is, involving immigrants and people of different languages, struggle. The solidarity was really, really quite remarkable when you think about what was going on in the period after World War One. There's a big strike wave in 1919, but we also get the Tulsa massacre, race massacring, and you get, lynching, anti-immigrant nativism. It's a period of tremendous racism. So that miners were able to pull this off, this kind of solidarity, is really an extraordinary legacy, very important, obviously, today. So I think that, in addition to the fact, this is, of course, this huge labor uprising, as you mentioned, the largest armed labor uprising since the Civil War, possibly in U.S. history. But in any case, the effort to suppress it really began. Chuck Feeney would argue, and I know you've had him on this podcast, he has a great book on the road to Bear Mountain, which is about the effort to preserve this battlefield. The effort to suppress this history really began during the Battle of Bear Mountain when Chapin, the sheriff of Logan County, and the very fiercely anti-union, jailed reporters and then monitored the dispatches to make sure that they were not, pro-union or promoting the miners' cause. And Chuck argues that that's really the beginning of the effort to suppress mine wars history that continued then in the form of, the governor in the 30s requiring that the New Deal Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which was commissioning state histories in each state, that the one done for West Virginia not include the mine wars or the labor struggles. It has been absent from the curriculum in public schools in West Virginia. So there's been this kind of erasure of the story of the mine wars in terms of public recognition and public education. That's been overt and direct, but I also want to mention a more subtle consequence of this offensive against the union that happened in the 1980s, which was when A.T. Massey and John Blankenship really moved violently to extirpate, root out the union from southern West Virginia, and was ultimately successful, unfortunately, so that to this day, or today, less than 10% of miners working in southern West Virginia are actually UMW members. The offensive really was, grossly successful, unfortunately. So, and what that enabled then in the aftermath was for the coal operators, West Virginia Coal Association and other mine owners, to really shift the narrative politically in the state away from a kind of labor focus or class focused discourse about, we workers need to stand together and we need to promote certain forms of legislation and so forth, towards a kind of enlistment of miners and their families into joining this, defending army against the war on coal. So it became the kind of political shape of the state became one of a war against outsiders who were trying to destroy the coal industry. Outsiders being, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Obama administration, in which there were undertones or overtones, in some cases, of racism in this rhetoric about how, oh no, we're not the enemy. Let's not even talk about class struggle. It's those outsiders, that outside force. And so there was this kind of silencing of class and class struggle that really persists to this day, unfortunately. And so at the same time, though, you can't say that it's been erased from memory. It certainly hasn't. I mean, in 2018, when the teachers went on strike in West Virginia, they wore, many of them, red bandanas, which were the symbol that miners used in 1921 in the March on Blair Mountain to signify their solidarity and their support for the Union cause. So, and the teachers strike again in Mingo County, where Matewan located. So, you know, as much as there's an effort to suppress or even erase, it hasn't been possible to do that totally by any means. And this is, of course, in part where the mine movement comes in. Because, you know, our conviction is that we not only need to preserve this history, we really need to lift it up as an incredibly important legacy for workers and their allies all over this country, and as a source of pride for people in Southern West Virginia. This is a tremendous contribution to the labor movement and a real inspiration. So the museum, as you saw, has a terrific set of exhibits. We're not talking some dusty little back room with some random memorabilia. I mean, it's really a top-notch series of exhibits about coal camp life, about life in tent colonies, about the Battle of Matewan. The location of the museum is literally across the street from where the battle occurred. And of course, you know, script, some of the weapons and shell casings and so forth that were used in the Battle of Blair Mountain. Lots of very informative and interesting artifacts and visuals, video recordings, photographs, and so forth. So the museum itself, I think, is a great destination. And as you mentioned, just getting there is really, it's a great experience. Beautiful area. And it's also a very educational drive. You know, if you've never been in Southern West Virginia or in Kentucky, some of the coal fields, you know, 2-lane roads, you can see old company stores, across the railroad tracks all the time, of course, the coal was going out on. And you're seeing, you know, the coal camp that still exists there. So we also do a lot of public programming, and that includes, you know, everything from book signings and film screenings to the strike supper we held a few years ago, where we had the foodways representative of the different groups who were living in the coal camps during the mine wars. That was literally not just sold out and standing alone, it was an overflow crowd. So, and then as you described, the centennial of the Battle of Blair Mountain, which was last year, drew some 3,000 people to a whole series of events around West Virginia and actually surrounding states. So, so those kinds of public programs that take the museum beyond its four walls, I think, are really important. That includes, as you mentioned, the curriculum in public school. It also includes our most recent project, which is to raise the money. This is a multi-year, multi-dollar project to memorialize and provide historical interpretation of key sites along the miners' march route from Marmet to Blair Mountain. And so we have managed so far to develop monuments at Marmet's beginning point and Sharpless, which is close to the end point of the march. And those will be unveiled Labor Day weekend this year. But we really want to build out the march route in other ways with other historical interpretive materials, Clio apps, online materials, and so on. So I urge listeners to go to wbminewars.org and you can see a lot more about the museum and what we're trying to do.
And get excited about our history and watch Matewan is a great movie by John Sayles as well, to really kind of just get your feet wet and then learn more about it. What's been the process of trying to get more curriculum on the mine wars with both state schools and I'm not even sure what the process would be to try to get it into a national curriculum.
But what we've done so far is to develop curriculum in cooperation with teachers, obviously sympathetic teachers in Mingo County and adjacent counties in southern West Virginia. We have a whole teacher advisory committee that has helped us develop curricula for, I think, 5th, 8th, and 11th grades. I might be off on some of those, but anyway, and they're available on our website. So we have not at this point pushed to get it officially required as part of the standards of learning or whatever at the state level, but it has been more a matter of getting the word out among teachers who adopt it and who also, regardless of what they do with what we have in terms of curricular offerings, we really encourage them to bring their classrooms to the museum too. So we have a lot of school children coming through the museum, which is just very exciting to see, and they get very excited about this history.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, what are some of the lessons from the Mine Wars for today that you've taken away?
Well, I think the most obvious but it still bears repeating is the importance of interracial, interethnic solidarity, and also the fact that in this context of an all-male workforce, where so much of the attention, the history telling, story making, and so forth focuses on minors, I think it's really important not to neglect the fact that this strike and this march did not happen without a lot of women who were behind the scenes. They were organizing the food, they were providing, makeshift medical care in little clinics. There were nurses with headbands marked W who do accompany the marchers. And I think a lesson from that is that, in any strike, you don't succeed without the support of women. Certainly in an all-male workforce like this, if women are holding down the family and stretching the money that you do have and so on. So that's a very important lesson. I think the other lesson that I would mention, which unfortunately remains true to this day, is the fact that if you've got the whole architecture of government arrayed against you, I'm talking the courts, law enforcement, now though it didn't exist at the time, the National Labor Relations Board, it is really hard to win. Now you can still win, and we are seeing that happening all over the country. It's a very exciting moment in terms of the resurgence of the labor movement, but we got a lot of work to do in terms of pushing a much more pro-labor environment generally, because in places like West Virginia, as we saw in the 1980s, it was just astonishing to me that it was possible for 18F to break the union in southern West Virginia. I mean, the legacy of unionism has been so strong there. People are so aware of the blood that was shed and the battles that were fought for Massey to be able to break that. That was entirely dependent on the fact that the state police were protecting convoys, scab coal. They were limited in the size of their picket lines. There were all kinds of restraining orders against the union and fines and so on. And so when you're living in that kind of atmosphere, it's real hard to win. I just read yesterday, actually, that the District 10 of the National Labor Relations Board is seeking to fine the United Mine Workers in the context of their more than a year-long strike now in northern Alabama.
Warrior met coal, it's insane, absolutely insane.
They want to levy a fine, basically, of over $13 million for Warrior met loss. I mean, hello, what is a strike about? But trying to incur losses on the part of the employer. And so, that's just another example of the, unfortunately, the power of the kind of anti-unionism that is like baked in right now in some of our national laws and practices and so on, court-building.
Yeah. The fight always remains. And I do want to just ask you one other question on the immigrant working class labor that was going on. So you had the racial issues as well, but there were a lot of immigrants in these coal mines that couldn't speak English as well, that the mine bosses would use to divide up the workplace. We're still seeing these echoes today. It's the same playbook that happens.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there was a one coal operator who quite explicitly said that you need a judicious mixture, as he put it, of native white mountaineers, black workers from the South, generally the Jim Crow South, and immigrant workers in order to maintain division. Housing tended to be segregated along those lines. So the effort was to divide, a very intentional effort to divide workers along the lines of, immigration status, language, and race. And again, in a context of real racist and nativist attitudes across the country as a whole. So it's really remarkable that they were able to overcome that. Which also, this is a kind of thinking back on the lessons of mine wars and Blair Mountain and so on. There are many reasons why I think miners were able to override that effort at division. And one of them certainly has to do with this dense context of coal camps, where, what sociologists call a density of acquaintanceship. You see other people, you work with them underground, you see them in the company store, you share the conditions of, prospect of being fired if you support the union, or being jailed, blacklisted, evicted from your home. Miners live in integrated tent colonies, when they were fired and evicted. And so you have this kind of commonality in place that I think is so important and so different from the context today, where, workers are commuting from hither and yon, and they're working different schedules, and don't have anything akin to that kind of place-based solidarity potential. And yet, or because of that, you have these, I think, brilliant organizing strategies like we saw with the Amazon work on Staten Island, where, Chris Malls and others are setting a bus stop organizing. You figure out a place where people converge and where you can build kind of community and solidarity, and you have food, and it acknowledges the importance of that kind of community and relationality to union organizing. And yeah, perhaps that's another lesson, which is that workers organize themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened in the mine wars. It wasn't that UMW was saying, "Oh, got to march on Blair Mountain." No.
No, and to put everything on the line as well, like
Yeah.
to put your daily bread, unable to feed your family if you lose the job, but it's more willing to fight. So where do you find inspiration and hope?
Oh gosh. Well, I find hope in its history. I mean, it's a remarkable story, but I also find inspiration and hope in what younger workers are doing today. I mean, there is such an upsurge in labor activism, and the work that's going on to organize in Starbucks and Amazon, but also in places like, I was just reading the other day about editors at publishing houses are organizing, architects in New York City are organizing. I mean, and I think part of what's happening is that we're seeing a kind of cultural sea change in how, especially younger generations, think about work. It's like, okay, yeah, I gotta have a job to pay my bills, but this is not the center of my life. I will not be controlled in the way that this boss wants to do. That's doggone hunt. We want more to life than work. And I see that in my own children. I mean, I think that's very positive.
So how can people support the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum?
Oh, please go to wvminewars.org and become a member. That is the backbone of our financial stability. We can get a grant here and there, but those foundations are fickle. It is you all who believe in this work who will make it possible for us to continue and expand and really get these stories out. So membership, $5 a month is the baseline. Join us. would love it. Thank you so much.
Well, I think as we're approaching the U.S. Labor Day, I think everyone should go to the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, take out some money, maybe 5, 10, 20, 50, $100,000, whatever you have, give it to the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, learn more about our labor history, support labor history, labor journalism, and make the pilgrimage to Matewan. And Barbara Ellen Smith, thank you so much for your time and everything you're doing.
Thank you, Evan. Thanks so much.